Hello. Greetings. How you doing there? How do you like that nice giant tomato? Ooh, still needs to ripen up for a day. It's big tomato. This is not one of those grocery store tomatoes. Yeah, not one of those. It's grown right here. Yes, yes, yes. I'd like to do an exhaustive discussion about what space and what space actually is. Interestingly enough, someone has spent a significant amount of time coming to understanding of what space actually is. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise that the ancient metaphysics vis-a-vis the Greeks and the Indians and what the true science says, and I really kind of hate the word science, not from the Aristotelian sense of the actual denotation of the term science. Science is used now kind of like a religion. Someone says, science! And what they're really saying is, shut your mouth, because, it's science. It's been written, So I don't like that word for science. But all this stuff, the ancient metaphysics and the perennialists agree with the actual, and there's no distinction between physics and metaphysics, but the point being is that vis-a-vis Advaita Vedanta, the Vedas, original Buddhism, the Platonists, the Neoplatonists, the Pythagoreans, and they all agree on this. So what is space really? And of course, human beings fundamentally have a horrific flaw in that we actually engage in concept reification. Kind of like everybody has in their mind what Bigfoot looks like, and of course this thing doesn't exist. We all have an idea of what unicorns and leprechauns look like, and of course these things don't exist either. And we have all these crazy ideas about things that don't actually exist, like space and shadows and waves. None of these things are real. They don't actually exist. Some of them are qualifiers, and we could talk about shadows, and we could talk about the nature of space, relational shadow here in a second. But what is space specifically? And I'd like to keep this video around about 28 minutes or so. I could talk about this quite literally probably for hours, but to keep it in a nutshell, is that space really is the negative image of the ether. And people say, well, what is the ether? What's the ether made of? Of course, the ether couldn't be made of anything. Therefore, it wouldn't be the ether by definition. We're not talking about non-Cartesian pure potential. Ether obviously is not in a where, because a where is a Cartesian locus of mass and magnitude within the physical universe, so that's completely impossible. But this video was not to talk about the ether, and I've done that endlessly in other videos, but space itself is ether rarefaction, yes? And in the case of a coaxial circuit of light, there's rarefactions and compressions along the induction of the coaxial circuit of light. And these compressions are called photons, which of course are wholly unreal. But I can see why they call them photons, because they're manifestations. And we have manifestations and demanifestations of energy along this coaxial circuit. So, but ether is a negative image, space is a negative image of the ether. Space specifically, and we'll go over this and some other points here to actually paint a very clear picture of what space actually is, because we all have been brainwashed with science fiction. Space, the final frontier. And this relativistic nonsense that, space-time. There's no such thing as space-time. Time is a measure, and space has no properties. That's the one thing, literally, and I can prove this with quotations, that Nikola Tesla railed against endlessly. Railed, foamed at the mouth almost. This is the notion that space has properties, that you could bend it, and this is completely ludicrous. Space has no properties whatsoever. Space is no different than a shadow, really. So we've all been brainwashed with this nonsense, especially in sci-fi movies, which all of us kind of grew up watching, of course. We all know that's true. But space is ether rarefaction. But what does that mean? We'll get to that. Let's talk about space in relationship to shadow, and then we'll talk about it in relationship to the metaphysics of the ancients, and then we'll actually talk about space as it physically, denotatively must be, what it actually is in definition. Not connotation, but denotation. Space is just actually no different than a shadow. We all think as a child, and we still think as adults, that shadow is a thing. Well, shadow is not a thing. A shadow is a privation of light. A shadow, of course, is the chaos. And we don't mean chaos as meaning disorder. The actual meaning of chaos, the ancient Greek chaos, which, of course, is really in definition to a chasm. You know, you open your mouth, you create a chasm on your face, for example. We're not talking about chaos as in randomness, because when you say chaos, that's what people think. Talking about the original definition of chaos is a chasm. So a shadow, of course, is a chasm of light, as manifest due to what? Of course, a shadow is a posterior attribute. A shadow is not a thing. A shadow is an absence of something. Chaos, i.e. this chaos left in the wake of matter. And we'll explain this quickly here. Light, of course, I don't know if you know this or not, but I mean, someone who studies light bends around corners, and light bends around corners for the same reasons that masses accelerate towards the midpoint between the two. You could say mutual mass acceleration, you could say gravitational attraction. I don't really care, neither does Mother Nature care. But light bends around corners for those exact same reasons. And of course, a shadow is not a thing. Rather, a shadow is a chasm of light, or a privation of light. And what is that chasm? That chasm is a chasm of pure potential. It's an effect of privation. Likewise, too, so is space a chasm of the ether. And we can think in terms, and the Indians did, think in terms of a wheel, and we'll talk about that in a second. The nave of the wheel, which the axle goes through, and of course the felly, and the circumference. And of course, a wheel really is just like the number 0, if we will. Let's talk about space in relationship to a wheel, because the ancient metaphysical symbolism, both of the Greeks and the Indians, as well as the Egyptians, of eternity and of space, is that of a wheel. And of course, a wheel is no different in representation than the number 0. But the Greeks didn't consider 0 to be a number. They also didn't consider 1 to be a number either, but let's talk about that in a second. You know, a shadow is space is pure impotency. You know, a shadow is an impotency of light. Space is pure impotency. It's the mirage, of course, of pure potential. And if you actually, and I'd like you to get this image in your head, we've all seen these nuclear blasts where a rising mushroom cloud exists, and it rises. And of course, it rises due to heat. But if we actually eliminate out the shaft of the mushroom cloud, that mushroom cloud, of course, is nothing other than a torus. It's an expanding torus. And of course, we're talking about like a softball-sized lump of plutonium or fissionable uranium. We've taken pure potential and manifest pure actuality. And it's not the conversion of matter to energy as we all think it is. It's actually the release of an enormous amount of kinetic energy. But the release of that enormous amount of kinetic energy, of course, manifests this enormous volume. It'd literally be no different than releasing a trillion tightly wound pocket watches. You know, their springs are tightly wound, has a lot of potential energy, releasing all at once in a millisecond an enormous amount of kinetic energy, which of course must therefore necessitatively manifest volume. And we have to talk about volume, the after effect of a volume, to correctly explain what space is. So, space is just this pure impotency, the mirage of pure potential. Specifically, though, space is a point circumference. If you actually make a point and then you actually draw a circumference from that point, space is this absence, circumference, volume. We could call a point circumference a specific reference you find in ancient metaphysics, and it'd take a little bit while to explain it, but if you think in terms of a point as being a representation of counter space, and the circumference, or a 0, to be the representation of, as in the ancient Pali, the word sabe, or the all, meaning as manifest, what is the volume or wake in the release of that energy, which of course, just like in the example of the mushroom cloud, the release of that kinetic energy. We all are marveling at the mushroom cloud, but what is the volume of the release of the kinetic energy that manifests the volume that, of course, is the release of this energy? And then, of course, we have to understand what energy is. We think of energy as the dissipation of energy. Human beings always have everything upside down and backwards. We think as incredible energy, that mushroom cloud, for example. But that's not energy. That's, of course, the impotency of energy. The energy would be that softball-sized lump of plutonium or uranium, in example. You know, something literally about this size. You know, manifesting this God knows how many thousands of kiloton mushroom cloud that were all ooh and ah, and of course will strip the paint off your house and, vaporize your dog. We think that's the energy, but that's not energy. That's the impotency of energy, of course. So space is a point circumference. That would be point hyphen circumference. Think about what a point circumference is. I can talk about that endlessly in the metaphysics thereof. Also, too, let's think about a clock. I don't have a clock right in front of me here, but we all know what a clock looks like with an hour hand and a second hand. The center of a clock, of course, there is no time. If we actually had the clock still working, right? We ripped the hour hand and the minute hand off of a clock, we would never be able to tell time. What is time at the axle or the center of that clock? That's still, still releasing its energy vis-a-vis the battery in the back of the clock, that little AA battery that powers the clock. We would never be able to tell time. The energy, of course, that drives that clock drives the hands which reach out and generate space, and of course have therefore volume. This is time, and of course time is a measure. Time doesn't exist either. Time is only a measure of masses and magnitudes of volume which are in space. Yeah. This is time, which of course is the measure of space and the masses and magnitudes that we say are, quote, in space. So, which is the receptacle, of course, i.e. space, of masses and matter. So, what's the nature of space relationship to, if you think about it as a thought analogy, of a clock that you've ripped the hour and minute hand off of? Space must be present for us to tell time. Time has no meaning without a second hand and a minute hand and an hour hand. Some clocks obviously have 3 hands. Space is the hollow of metaphysics. The ether, of course, that being the one. We could say counter space, we could say zero-point energy, we could say subspace. Doesn't matter what we call it. These are all silly names. People get caught up in names or, of course, lost in a sea of confusion. So, space is the hollow of metaphysics in which physics does its endless, of course, eternal dance. Space has no dimension, but it is the matrix of all things which, of course, have dimension. Space is pure impotency. I must repeat once again that Nikola Tesla accurately told you that space has no properties. There's no notion of bending space-time any more than there's a notion of bending unicorn farts. It's ridiculous. It's a conceptual idea with no basis in fact, reality, logic, or wisdom. There is no such thing as bent space-time. Yeah, we're talking about ether rarefaction. Yeah, kind of like a vacuum. They say nature abhors a vacuum. Well, nature abhors an ether rarefaction. This is the reason why masses accelerate not towards one another, but towards the lowest null pressure point between the two, which of course is the direction of centripetal convergence, i.e. the movement towards counter space, which is the erasure of space. But what is space? How are you going to erase something that doesn't exist? Well, think about that for a second, and we'll explain that here very quickly. So, when work is done, of course, something is done or made. This work has as its wake, of course, what is made, and a hollow of the energy spent in the making. And this is so very important. It's a metaphysical point, and it's an absolute undeniable point. When work is done, whether that be filling your gas tank up in your car, doing work, driving 1,000 miles or whatever on the gas that you put in your car. When work is done, something is done or something is made in the doing, or possibly both, depends on what it is. This work has as its wake necessitated effect what is made, and a hollow of the energy is spent in the making. Yes? When energy is spent, something is done and or something is made. This wake of the expenditure of energy is space itself. This is the reason why magnetism and dielectricity are the conjugate geometry of the universe. Magnetism is literally the field modality of the ether of the making of space. Space is the after effect of a divergent magnetic field, as I've said a million times. The loss of energy is, of course, always equal to volume, i.e. the creation of space. But space is not a thing. Space is no different than a shadow. We say, a shadow is a noun in the dictionary, but a shadow is not a thing. A shadow is an absence of light. Space is not a thing. It's also a noun in the dictionary, but it's an absence. It's ether rarefaction. It's the impotency of the ether, also to the necessitative volume of work and energy having been expended. In this case, we're talking about the ether. That's the reason also, too, why I have 1 over 5 to the power of negative 3 tattooed over my hand. We're talking about principle and attribute. The work that is done in the division of the one as against itself, i.e. its extrinsic attribute, just like light and illumination. This doing of work creates the many. Yeah? And the creation of the many, we create volume. Work is done and energy is expended, and space is its inevitable necessitative byproduct in so doing, making, and expending energy and doing work. Yes? This is undeniable by physics or any branch of metaphysics throughout all of history. So the loss of energy is always, of course, volume, i.e. the creation of space. This emptiness, and emptiness is not a thing, something is empty of something else, also too a qualifier. So no such thing as emptiness. This is empty of that. There is absolutely no such thing as emptiness, by the way. I have to point that out. This emptiness is space, but emptiness, like I just said, is not a thing, but an absence of a thing, or a principle, that being, of course, the ether. 1 is not a number, 2, as I've also pointed out, rather a principle. 0 is also not a number either, rather a placeholder representing space, or the volume of the 1, as manifest due to the loss of some of its energy. Yes, this is the reason why the extrinsic attribute of the absolute is phi over the power of negative 3. 1 over phi to the power of negative 3 manifests all. You get into Plato's Republic divided line section 509d to 511 in Plato's Republic, that would take hours and hours to discuss. So, as far as ancient metaphysics, by the way, the samsara, which literally means the round cycle of being, it's literally the ancient Pali word for hell, if you will, samsara. Samsara literally means to go round and round, samsarati. Magnetism is a three-dimensional force vector, the three-dimensional S-curve that goes round and round. The point, and a point too is still a concept, round and round the point. And point is just a conceptual abstraction human beings use to communicate. But magnetism is that three-dimensional force vector that goes round and round a point in counter space, forming a torus. That is samsara. Samsara is the going around, the manifesting, demanifesting over and over and over in perpetuity. All of metaphysics and all of physics itself are in complete unison on what space actually is. It's that human beings are not taught this stuff, they don't study this stuff, they don't learn this stuff, which is a matter for another discussion. So, space is literally no different and is exactly like samsara, to go round and round. But to go round and round, one must have volume. That volume, the toroidal geometry of centrifugal divergence, where energy is expended. The expenditure of energy is, of course, leads to suffering. The cycle of becoming, bhava nubhava in the ancient Pali, of course, for example. There's 2 types of space, too, if you will. And in Pali, there's 2 words for it. And they sound exactly the same, almost, kind of. Dukkha and sukha. Du and su, yeah? Dukkha and su. Dukkha, of course, is suffering, means worldly existence. Sukha, yes, we're talking about bliss and pain. Dukkha is pain, suffering, yada yada. Sukha is like saying bliss, permopia, the ultimate bliss. So we have 2 types of infinity, if you will. The infinity of impotency of energy, which would be the toroid, and the space of infinite potential, which of course would be, and I really kind of hate the word counter space. We say counter space, 0 point energy, we say the ether. Doesn't really matter. These all mean one and the same thing. So we have the space that we all have within our head that we think about, from science fiction and so forth, the space out there, the space between me and you, that's the space everybody has an idea of in their head. And of course, there's a space of pure bliss and pure potential, which is not a space at all, but is infinite. And of course, space is just the mirage of true infinity, because space, it is pure impotency. And that's why it's the negative, the antiparticle, if you will, of pure bliss and pure potential. The negative particle, if you will, or the antiparticle, if you will. I don't like to talk about particlism. Of pure potential and pure infinity is, of course, pure impotency and pure suffering and pure becoming, or in the ancient Pali, bhava nubhava, which means becoming and rebecoming. So, space is literally samsara. The nave of the wheel, And have you ever seen an old wagon wheel? There's a nave in the center. The nave of the wheel, of course, represents counter space, the ether. The space between the nave and the circumference, of course, represents dukkha. The nave itself, the hollow in the middle of that wheel, would, of course, represent sukha, the direction towards there. And this, of course, is all manifest in 100% agreement within the physics of the conjugate geometry of the universe, space and counter space, centripetal convergence, and centrifugal divergence, the outflow and the inflow, which of course are forever connected. When you say yin and yang, I don't care what people say, it doesn't matter. It's conjugate geometry of the totality of the universe and everything within it. Respectively, the geometry of the hyperboloid of counter space and the geometry of the torus, representing the manifestation of space. So, space is the mirage of infinite potential and called infinity. Space between the nave and the circumference, between the center of the wheel and the circumference, this is dukkha. The middle of the nave of the wheel is bliss, is pure potential, is the reason why it's called sukha. Sukha and dukkha. I know you're not really interested in ancient Pali, but all of these things are in complete agreement. Zero is to number, and this is really important to listen up closely. Zero is to number, number 2, 3, 4, 5. Zero is to number as possibility, i.e. the counter space, i.e. pure potential, i.e. the ether. Zero is to number as possibility is to actuality. What is actual is always manifest and of magnitude. So, what is manifest and of magnitude means the expenditure, of course, of energy. What is manifest and of magnitude is only manifest and of magnitude because work has been done. And when work is done, volume is created because energy is expended. When work is done, energy is expended. There's nobody in the entire universe that can deny that undeniable fact. Work is done, energy is expended. And as a result, you have two things. You have the work that is done and the void or chaos. Okay, original definition of chaos, okay? You have the void, and what is manifest. So, we have something that is done and or something that is made, and the resultant of that energy that is expended to make that what is done or what is made. And that is space. This is the reason why magnetism is the three-dimensional force vector of the loss of energy or inertia that is the ether, which is the loss of potential. Yes? The loss of energy manifests just like that mushroom cloud, yeah? The release of an enormous amount of kinetic energy or potential manifests as enormous. A mushroom cloud is nothing other than a huge hyperboloid or donut on top of a plume cloud, yeah? Ignore the plume cloud that goes straight up. Just focus on that huge toroidal geometry on top there. So what is manifest and of magnitude means the expenditure of energy. Space is the after effect of a divergent magnetic field, as I've said many times. But what does that mean? So space is a resultant volume of that division of the one as against its attribute. Or once again, 1 over 5 to the power of -3, and that takes hours to explain that. So let me repeat that again. It's really quite important. Space is the resultant volume of the division of the one as against its attribute, like light and illumination. What is the resultant effect of illumination, which is the extrinsic attribute of light? What the good is also what the good does. What it is and what it does are one thing. The good does good, right? Light does illumination, right? What is the after effect of illumination? Is it not the creation of volume, the expenditure of energy such that light goes forth? Yes? Light and illumination are not two different things. They are principle and attribute of one thing. It's also, too, the reason why the first few numbers of the Fibonacci sequence are 1 and 1. So, dilution is temporal manifestation or the product of division, but the division of the one is not to make more than one, which is impossible, but to make the one voluminous. Infinity is the mirage of pure potential, which is one. One is not a number, as I've said, but the principle of the volume of infinity, which is space. I hope you liked this video. If you'd like me to continue on this, I could talk about it for another hour at least. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, any donation is warmly welcome. If you don't like it, also, too, let me know. Thank you for watching. Lux Evertas.